recording the webinar today so we can make sure to share it. I know there's a number of folks who probably want to be here and can't because of scheduling conflicts. A quick note, if you would like live transcription in WebEx, for those who are not familiar with it, you can go to the lower right-hand portion of your screen and click on the three dots. And if you select, I think it's captions and highlights, you will get some live transcription. So hopefully that will be helpful. As a general rule or norm for today's session, we're going to centralize comments and questions in the chat today. So keep them coming throughout the session, throughout the conversation. And you can find the chat bubble on the lower right. It seems like most of you have found it, but just to make sure, and you can make sure that you select that you're chatting with everyone, assuming that's your intention, to post questions and comments. You can also have sidebars and other conversations. And again, this is a chance to reconnect for some of us with the broader community. So we invite all connections. I also want to make sure that I mention that this is part one of a two-part series. And in part two, which we're anticipating to be mid-June, we're going to dive a little bit more into specific strategies and feature more of an implementer's perspective. Today, the panel is bringing the USAID perspective, and we would love to hear from our implementing partners in terms of how they are or could be applying some of the strategies coming out of this paper and this work to our overall efforts to shift the locus of learning in market systems development, but really cross-sectoral. And slight spoiler alert, my own takeaway from this paper is really about how this is not just applicable to market systems development, although market systems development as a technical approach has, in my opinion, often been in the lead in these types of things, but it really can be translated to any of the sectors within which we work across international development contexts. So delighted to have both our friends from enterprise development, economic growth, market systems, private sector, as well as monitoring, evaluation, learning, CLA communities, knowledge management, all of those expertise we're anticipating joining us today. So thank you so much. Again, watching that number go up, inviting folks to introduce yourself in the chat. And maybe just a quick note on today's agenda. We'll be quickly giving a brief on the paper, especially just as a reminder, folks, if you haven't had a chance to read it as yet, hopefully this is inspiration to do so. We're having a fantastic panel bringing different perspectives from USAID, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So again, we invite you to say hello to your friends who might be on the webinar and get ready for some really interesting conversation. Maybe give it one more minute because I see that number is still climbing. I should do a quick introduction of myself for those who I don't know. My name is Lane Pollock, and I am a senior learning advisor in USAID's Policy Planning and Learning Bureau. Sorry, I had to think about that because we're in the middle of a transition on that. And I'm in the CLA practice area. So my day-to-day work for about 10 years has wonderfully been advancing, collaborating, learning, and adapting across the agency. I actually came out of this technical area way back when. And prior to this, I was also an implementing partner, actually, back when we called it enterprise development and then value chains. And so have a deeply heartfelt connection to this work and the learning that this particular technical area can bring to CLA, to learning, and to this experience across the agency. Okay. I think that we are going to kick off our content presentation. I think maybe the next slide. So I would like to hand it over to Ben Fowler, who I've also known for years and have a great deal of respect for both his research and practicality in terms of his approach. Ben is the co-founder of MarketShare and CEO of MarketShare's Associates, but also is the lead author of the paper that we're going to be discussing today. He serves as a senior technical advisor for the Market Systems Partners M&E and CLA Learning Workstream. And he is going to give us just a super brief overview of the paper, its findings, and recommendations. So Ben, over to you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that, Lane. And I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to share a brief overview of this paper, Shifting the Locus of Learning, with all of us today. There's a lot to explain, and I'm not going to be able to get into all of it. So I'm going to start off with basically just walking us through 3 key takeaways from the paper. But I should start it with the genesis. As Lane mentioned, this paper was born from the MSP activity and really from the question of what more do we need to know about our partners, particularly our private sector partners, in terms of their own learning. We focused a lot and learned a lot about internal program learning, but there are a lot of knowledge gaps that we recognized existing in terms of how our partners learn. What are the impediments to more effective learning? What are the incentives, as well as the disincentives for that learning to happen? And what is the type of learning that tends to be highest priority for this group? In essence, we wanted to learn more about learning. And so that was the genesis for this paper. To do so, we undertook an ambitious literature review that included about 90 books and publications, both from the academic literature and the development sector, as well as a series of key informant interviews with sector experts who were putting this into practice. We looked at literature including adaptive dynamic capabilities, system learning, firm learning, and many others, which help to inform our takeaways today. In that process, what was originally meant to be a 3 to 5 page brief ballooned to 17. We just had more and more that we felt we couldn't leave out. And so I'm very pleased to dive in and, as I mentioned, share 3 key takeaways that came out for us. The first one is that learning is at the heart of the process of economic development. When you look at various stories around sectors and countries that have rapidly developed, you tend to see a process in which learning and learning processes have dramatically improved. In our research, we found that learning is often responsible for enhancements in competitiveness, resilience, and more inclusiveness for both firms, but also the systems and the economies in which they exist. At its core, we think learning can be seen as a critical system function and one that can both catalyze and quicken systemic change and enable adaptation. But that being said, despite its importance, learning doesn't happen automatically, and it can often happen at suboptimal levels. As Stiglitz and Greenwald say, markets on their own will not create a learning society, or even if they do, they will do so more slowly and less extensively than they should. We dove into some of the factors that can be. One is that learning is a social activity. So in environments characterized by relatively limited trust and cooperation, that can be an impediment to sharing information and knowledge. It's path dependent, so it often depends upon the existing stock of knowledge. It's influenced by our cognitive frames and the social norms in which we exist. And the organizational contexts and priorities also greatly influence how and the extent to which learning happens. That was one of the initial challenges we received. Isn't it the case that any rational actor, such as a firm, will invest to the extent they need to? And that if there's any underinvestment, so to speak, in learning, that must just simply be that it's not a good or a wise use of resources? Well, the answer is that whole fields of study exist primarily to be dedicated to how to enhance learning capacity at an individual, an organizational, and increasingly at a sectoral and an economy-wide level. So that clearly, even in the context that there is willingness and interest in increased learning, often a challenge with how to do so effectively. So that takes us, and before I go any further, on the next slide, I want to talk quickly about what do we actually mean by learning. One of the processes in developing this paper was encountering a few stumbling blocks around language. One was with private sector itself. Learning can come off as development speak sometimes. And there's a whole host of other phrases that are often more commonly employed on the screen, which speak to the types of language that's typically used to describe the process of gathering new information and using it to inform decision making. Beyond that, even within our own sector, we discovered a bit of a disconnect in what we talk about when we're speaking of enhancing learning. After all, just about any development program is improving learning of our partners. What we really wanted to focus on, and where we really honed in the focus of this paper, was not so much providing an initial learning event, for example, an exchange visit or embedding a consultant or something else, but actually enhancing the capacity and capability for learning beyond what it already is among our partners. That is the fundamental difference in what we're talking about today. So let's switch to our second takeaway. Our second takeaway is that at its core, what we're talking about today is shifting the locus of learning from being primarily a program-focused function to being one that's system-focused. So in its essence, what we're arguing is that learning itself can become a key driver of the type of systemic changes that we're aiming for anyway, and that we should be thinking about it in that lens, not simply as a mechanism for improved program effectiveness and funder accountability. If we agree to that, or we're willing to entertain it, then we must recognize that this means a shift in agency. So we would stop envisioning the program being at the center of a process of directing learning towards one in which we are strengthening the capability of our partners and our focus systems to better learn and adapt themselves. So if we go to the next slide, and for those of you who've been in the MEL space for a while, or even if you haven't, I think you're probably very familiar with the concept of PROVE, or the program, the accountability function that's funder focused, with the funder at the locus of learning, in essence, capturing the information that helps to demonstrate performance. And a lot of work has been done over time to help bolster, alongside the PROVE role, one of improve, in which we're capturing information and we're using it with the program at the center of the locus of learning to enhance program effectiveness. Both PROVE and improve are fundamental, and they'll never go away, nor should they. Nevertheless, they both see learning as primarily an internal program function, just with different locus of learning. What we would argue is that what this paper is putting forward is a shift towards learning as a transformative process, or towards transformative learning. At that one, the funder and the program don't disappear, but they're facilitating a learning process of our partners and our focus systems. That, at its core, is what we propose to add to the existing PROVE and improve learning functions that already and will continue to exist. So if we accept both of those, then the next takeaway was, well, is this actually possible to change? It could be that learning is critical. It's something that we should be focused on, and yet ultimately learning will happen at the pace that it happens. Well, fortunately, we set out to speak to a broad range of different programs that were donor financed, to find out what, if any of them, were trying to tackle this issue. We captured a range of different examples, and we were able to synthesize those into two broad types of strategies. One focused at the market actor level and focused on enhancing the learning capability of a particular partner. Another set of strategies sought to address the systemic constraints that were inhibiting learning across a broad range of market actors. And so when we looked at those, we grouped those, we generally saw that there were two sets. And on the next slide, we'll see three of those strategies fell into the first bucket of being focused on individual market actors, while the remaining 7 focused on strategies that would enhance target systems. So I'm going to quickly talk through an example of each to give you an idea of what this can really look like in practice. So within the first bucket, I'll focus on the customer centricity and supplier insights. Because in the first bucket, many times programs are seeking to address one or both of true primary constraints. One is that partners, for a myriad of reasons, don't always value the type of learning that's going to, or don't sufficiently value the type of learning that will promote competitive, resilient, and inclusive growth. And also, the second type of constraint is that when they do, they may lack some of the internal capabilities to effectively capture, analyze, and use information for that purpose. What many programs have found is that the language of customer centricity, which is the concept of putting the customer at the heart of your work as a business, is often a very helpful entry point. The aim of many customer centricity strategies is to improve the lifetime value of your customer, improve customer retention, average transaction rate, and many other elements that tend to speak directly to a firm's bottom line. Yet at the same time, that learning process is also one that can easily unlock inclusive development strategies. So to give one example, the Inclusive Agricultural Markets Program in Uganda, Feed the Future funded, is supporting a range of its agribusiness partners to better enhance their learning capability. Instead of directly going and capturing data, analyzing it, and presenting it back to those firms or hiring a specific consultant, embedding it within those companies, what it's doing instead is working with them to enhance their own internal learning function. That's meant identifying and working with the people within those companies that have that responsibility. Those tend to sit in different parts of the company. And then identifying what are the elements of the inclusive business strategies that you're attempting to apply that you don't fully understand or that you would like to understand better, that would help you to enhance your own customer centricity. From there, they've worked directly with those programs on applying a range of different strategies around collecting, analyzing, and ultimately feeding that data back into their process. That's helped them to benchmark against some of their competitors and otherwise do it. So that fast cycle learning process has been one that has actually enabled these companies to increasingly apply for themselves the techniques of customer research and customer centricity to inform their business model strategies. I'll now focus on another example that's from the right side of the graphic, and that's around disruptive technologies to enhance transparency and feedback loops. Many of the strategies on this side of the quadrant are ones that focus on trying to address those systemic barriers to learning. In the case of number 5, one thing that we've seen is that systems in which there are relatively few learning signals are ones where change tends to happen more slowly. Market actors can either ignore or just unaware of whether or not their products and services are working effectively. That slows down learning, means they're less responsive and typically less effective as businesses. In a particular example from Uganda, the ag inputs activity sought to address the issue of rampant counterfeit inputs, agricultural inputs, by the introduction of a technology of a barcode that would go onto the agricultural inputs. What this meant was a very slow learning process in which farmers would have to purchase inputs, apply them, have them not work, and only then wonder but not be fully sure about whether or not those inputs actually worked, was replaced by one in which pre-purchase they would be able to discover whether or not they were actually buying a legitimate input. This helped drive dramatic and fast behavior change among agricultural retailers who had a very quick feedback loop now from potential customers if they were found to be selling illicit goods. Similarly, in the case of Kenya with Habitat for Humanity, they found that many customers who were seeking affordable housing services from Masons were getting poor quality services. And part of that was that their main source of referrals were friends and family for whom they didn't want to complain for fear of damaging those social relationships. In this particular case, that was resolved by creating an online review mechanism that was anonymous and enabled there to be much faster and a greater number of feedback loops within the market around the relative quality of different service providers. This made it much easier for potential customers to know whether or not the particular vendor they were considering was going to be effective or not. So these are just 2 among 10 examples of different strategies that can be used to enhance learning capability, both at a specific market level, market actor level, as well as the system level. So just to conclude, and I will say as well, I've chosen examples today that are primarily from firms, but to Lane's earlier point, many of these examples, and in fact, some within the paper also speak beyond private sector examples to educational institutions, to farmer organizations, and many others. So just to wrap and to conclude before we move over to the webinar and to our panel, I would say learning is at the heart of economic development. It can drive competitive, resilient, and inclusive improvements for our partner firms and target systems, but it won't happen automatically. We argue to make the shift that's needed, we need to shift the locus of learning away from ourselves as funders and as implementing partners towards our partners and our target systems, and that there's a range of at least 10 different strategies out there which programs have already been using to effectively promote this shift. And so there's lots there. As I said, there's lots more I could say. There's parts of the paper I didn't get a chance to get into, but I hope that is an adequate start to feed this panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Ben. That was more than adequate. That was wonderful. And thank you again for just kind of walking us through some of the key takeaways in particular. I think they will really resonate with lots of folks. I was scanning the participant list and I see so many familiar names. It's great to see folks. So we are now going to shift into the panel discussion for about 15 to 20 minutes. I am honored to introduce my colleagues from USAID, including Mandeep, from the Acting Managing Director of External Influence Team from USAID's Private Sector Engagement Hub. Introducing also Jorge Reyes Reina, who I've worked with multiple times over some years. He's a project management specialist in food security and energy from USAID Honduras, who really has some great kind of on the ground experience to share. And then my colleague Jessica McDonis from the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security, still practicing the new name, who's a human and institutional capacity development advisor. We are going to do some question and answer based upon what Ben just presented and the paper. I will also flag that we'll continue to share the link to the paper if by chance you haven't gotten that in your email already. So as we get started, I actually want to ask all of the panelists to respond to the first question, which is, you each work in slightly different spaces. As I said earlier, you're coming with different lenses across USAID. Given your orientation or your work, can you tell us one aha moment for you in this brief, in this paper, something that really resonated, something that really stood out? And I'll actually go to Mandeep first.
Thank you, Lane. And Ben, thank you for the research and the presentation that you delivered. And thank you to everybody who's joined us today from across the world. Again, Mandeep Jungi with USAID's Private Sector Engagement Hub. It was hard to pick one aha moment or just one piece that really resonated. But there was a pair of terms, Lane, and Ben, you had mentioned this during your remarks about trust and feedback loops that really stuck out to me. When I think about trust, it's this belief that others, right, will make choices that's in the best interest of the partnership, or in other cases, just for others. I spent most of my career within the private sector. And when I think about the concept of trust in my daily life, I think about trusting a brand when I'm making a purchase. And when I think about my personal life, I think about the flow of information between me and other human beings. when we trust that a brand or a business or another market actor, right, in this case, is acting with my best interest in mind, there is that willingness to give more information, right? That importance of data, which can be used for knowledge and insights. But I also think there can also be a higher tolerance for accepting the mistakes or errors that that other market actor or that other person can make, because that's so important. Because the work that we're trying to do here to address the world's greatest challenges through systems isn't easy, as we all know, and it doesn't happen overnight, which is why being able to cultivate that trust to let learning flow is really important. Um, I do want to do a shout out to an additional research piece that also came from USAID, the Enduring Results Study, which looked at what made partnerships sustain results long after USAID and other actors pulled out. And, Ben, Lane, and team, trust was one of those drivers of sustained partnerships. Whether it was the credibility that each actor brought to the table, their record of being able to deliver, their interpersonal relationships, but also their willingness to collaborate. So that's just something that I would highlight right there. And I think, Ben, you had mentioned the Feed the Future Uganda activity. That, when it highlighted the feedback loop and how accountability was placing trust into the system, really stood out to me with, I think it was the e-verification around the seeds. So those are just a few points that really stood out to me. Trust and feedback loops. Over.
So much, Mandeep. Okay, over to you, Jorge. What stood out to you in terms of this brief?
Good morning, everyone. Yeah, so much like Mandeep, I found myself nodding along as I read several sections of the brief. Something that really stuck with me was about the areas in which AID or other development agencies or donors have the opportunity to partner with businesses to implement new models, new innovative models, and thinking of the conditions that have to be present for that, and the role that learning plays into this. In Honduras, the Honduran economy has a very low level of complexity and is very susceptible to shocks. In 2020, just along the entire world, we were experiencing the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then in November, within a span of 15 days, we had two major hurricanes. So this really tested the resiliency of the Honduran economy. And it really it provided a valuable incentive for all private sector firms to focus more on investing in learning and innovation, not just as a competitive tool, as something that's like a nice to have, but actually as a survival strategy, right? So that they could recover and rebuild and look at new business models. This was very fertile ground for partnerships where USAID can play the role of buying down that initial risk and that initial cost of piloting innovations, trying new models. And we saw that this was an opportunity for, to find more willing partners that were looking for new models and approaches that could strengthen their core business while aligning with our development goals. Mechanisms such as, pay for performance, matching grant funds, or the such. When I'm looking at our current portfolio of partnerships and comparing it to what it was back in February of 2020, I see a significant scaling up of the partnerships that we have to enhance e-commerce capabilities for small and medium enterprises and for entrepreneurs, which again quickly went from a nice to have to something that was the difference between being able to survive. But not only for SMEs and entrepreneurs, but also for big firms, that have like a 5-10 year plan and are always working on the next big thing that's going to be like their new business model within 10 years from now. Suddenly they were in a situation where they needed to speed up some of these plans and implement some of these innovative models. And this also created a lot of opportunities for us.
Thank you so much, Jorge. And Jessica, welcome to the conversation. We're so glad you're here.
Thanks, Lane. I also, like our other panelists, wanted to just start by saying I think the brief is really just so great. And I commend the Market Systems and Partnerships Activity Team and others for their work on it. So similarly, it's really hard for me to select just one aha moment as well. Thinking about my role in the Bureau for Resilience and Food Security, serving on the drafting team of the agency's new policy on local capacity strengthening, I think maybe I'll start with a general reflection based on my work from a slightly different lens and of that on local capacity strengthening. So I think fundamentally at its core, local capacity strengthening is also about the process of learning. In fact, the local capacity strengthening policy definition of capacity includes the words "to learn." It defines capacity as accompanying the knowledge, skills, and motivations, as well as the relationships, and we've heard about that from our other panelists, the importance of trust, but enables actors then to take action, to design and implement solutions to local development challenges, to learn, right, and to adapt from that action and to innovate and transform over time. So again, if learning is really at the heart of both local capacity strengthening, an area which I spend a lot of time working on, and at the heart of economic development, like Ben asserts and this paper asserted earlier, then you can see why it's really so hard for me just to pick one aha moment from the paper. Nonetheless, if I must, I think one element of the brief that I really appreciate is from the box at the top of page 8. Which reflects or prompts the reader to reflect on and shift away from interventions or approaches that focus on addressing singular knowledge gaps, and instead to focus on approaches that enhance a market actor's capacity to learn. And I appreciate that this is really the whole point of the paper, right? But I think what the brief does so well is bring to life this idea through examples. And like Ben, I also really keyed in on the examples from Uganda. And as in the paper described one example, that making this shift, right, might mean that instead of delivering a training or organize an exposure visit on a narrowly defined topic, a project or activity might partner with local firms to collect and analyze firm level data and then learn through that process of looking at that data about why and how focusing efforts on perhaps more inclusive customer service strategies can both improve the firm's marketing as in alignment with their own goals, but help us also achieve broader, more inclusive development goals that we may have in other sectors or more broadly as well. And just one, I guess, final note on that. I think the recommendations and examples from the brief also really demonstrate alignment with the local capacity strengthening policy principles. So, for example, policy principle 2, which focuses on strengthening diverse capacities through diverse approaches. And this brief really encourages us to do that and to think beyond our comfort zone and approaches. Then it also really aligns with policy principle 5, appreciate and build on existing capacities. I think that principle, which encourages us not to focus on identifying gaps or weaknesses, but really rather to support local actors and communities in identifying their strengths and envisioning ways that they can use and build on their strengths as well as other community assets, is a theme that kind of comes out in this paper as well. So thanks, Ben and team, for putting, I think, these ideas of really focusing on learning through these great examples in the brief.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And I'm feeling more and more honored that I was serving in Uganda when some of these activities were being implemented and really learning from that and what learning looked like in these activities. So it's great to see this years later and how it's coming to fruition. Speaking of which, Jorge, we're going to turn to you because one of the EG programs, the Transforming Market Systems work that you've been leading for some years now, is featured a few times in the paper in terms of practicing some of these lessons already and what difference that has made. Can you say a little bit, like 2 minutes, about how those interventions have really served the overarching goal of transforming market systems in USAID's work in Honduras? How is it that these learning related interventions have been so central to the mission's goals of competitiveness, inclusion, resilience, all of these things? I know that you also hold this quite dearly in terms of how the projects have played out.
Yeah, thanks. TMS had our transforming market systems activity had an initial inception phase where we did a lot of analysis of the economic sectors when we were defining what should be the areas that the activity would be focusing on. And something that became clear during that initial inception phase was how people in the market system were disconnected and not working together effectively to change the system. It was also pretty evident that the local systems were not generating the evidence and sharing the knowledge needed for people to learn collectively and to figure out how the system could work better. Policy dialogue and advocacy was driven by opinions and not so much by data and evidence. So it was a lot of people sharing what was in their gut and what they knew, but when they were actually asked for ways or for hard data that could prove those points, that was not there. And donors would fill this gap, by funding studies, but this, filled the gap in the moment, but it created like little pockets of knowledge and perpetuated this dependency on external or donor support to be able to fill these gaps. So we saw low levels of trust in the system and an inability to organize around evidence and learn how to change the system. Through TMS, USAID has built up local capacities of local actors to generate evidence and strengthen local networks to disseminate this knowledge. TMS has invested in local partnerships, including a research platform with the National University of Honduras, the Private Sector Council, COEP, and more than 20 chambers of commerce to develop this knowledge. Also, USAID has mobilized several network building initiatives, including the Ecosystems Builders Community, which is featured in the briefer, to mobilize, to support sharing, learning, and collective action between local organizations. These initiatives have been vital to building the resilience of the system with very tangible results. Just one example, if I may, is how the private sector and local government used the market systems diagnostic that they are developing with the National University during the initial onset of the COVID-19 pandemic to measure precisely how each sector of the economy was feeling the pain of the economic shutdown, and define a road to recovery that led to emergency fiscal policies, creation of sorely needed technical assistance programs, and targeted financial aid packages to support the initial recovery.
Thank you so much, Jorge. And again, there's also a CLA case competition entry from Transforming Market Systems and other presentations that it is a really great case study for those interested in this topic. So I want to close out the panel with one question. I'm going to give you each a minute so we can make sure we turn to our participants, who are many. I want to encourage our participants to start sending out your questions, post them in the chat, your comments, your reactions. We really would love to make sure we address those in the remaining time. But for each of you, if you were going to pick one thing, which I know, as Jessica said earlier, it's hard, like constraining you, one thing that you would like to see us, and by us, I mean USAID itself, our implementing partners, this community of practitioners, do differently to put this paper's recommendations into action, what would that be? It could be around design, implementation, oversight, any of the different functions that, again, we as a community collectively play. So I'll actually start with Jessica.
Great, thanks, Lane. I think I'd like to perhaps build on Jorge's last example that he shared around peer-to-peer learning networks. And I think I'll just start by saying that we know that achieving and sustaining development outcomes really depends on the contributions of multiple and interconnected actors across all of our work sectors. And I think then deriving from that, I know while it may be more difficult, it may take more time to see impact. I think if I had to pick one piece of advice from this brief that we might do differently, it would really to be focusing on enhancing the learning performance of networks. I know it's oftentimes easier to default to working with individual actors. Again, it takes more time to see the fruition, but I think that that ultimately yields results in all of the other factors that we've been hearing from our other panelists about: trust, relationships, and ultimately more sustainable results. And so I think shifting towards that focus of working and prioritizing with networks of actors would be my key takeaway from this, whether that's in, I think, design, monitoring, evaluation, or learning, but really placing our energies there.
Yeah, all of the above. Thanks, Jessica. Jorge, over to you.
Thanks. So I think that in terms of implementation, I have been with AID for almost 10 years. And ever since I've been here, working with a private sector, I've heard some version of, we need to work more closely with local partners, and we need to bring them along, and we need to teach them our language. And one idea that I think is sprinkled throughout this paper, and that is probably most overt in the very first breakout idea box that I think was featured in the presentation that Ben shared at the beginning of the webinar, the one that's titled "Must We Call It Learning?" is that if we truly want the focus of learning to change from the donor side over to the actors in the system, then those actors, particularly those in private sector, need to understand the importance of the system changes and learning about the system so that they take full ownership of the partnerships. And this includes, setting learning agendas that speak to their interest, to their core business, whether that's maximizing profit for the private firm or reaching a certain goal, towards, greater transparency for a community-based organization. If we want the partners to be the ones that are owning the learning agenda and the learning process, they need to understand how that supports their core business and how that is aligned to what they really care about.
Yes, absolutely. Well said, Jorge. And I just want to mention quickly that my colleagues in PPL and the knowledge management and organizational learning space have been doing some great webinars and engagement around kind of surfacing learning priorities within local systems, local communities, et cetera. And we're talking about it more from an enterprise perspective, but kind of more broadly within the system. Okay, Mandeep, over to you for our final kind of recommendation going forward, and then we'll turn to questions.
Certainly. I think Jessica and I are on the same wavelength with this one, because my recommendation to this audience is to foster and then utilize relationships with business associations and networks. Jorge and Ben both had mentioned chambers of commerce before in some of these examples. I think what's exciting about these types of associations is frankly just the reach that they can have to a diversity number of market players specific to industries, but also just broadly across the private sector to begin with. And one thing that I often think about in the PSE Hub is how do we utilize these local associations and networks to complement our understanding of the local markets in order to make sure that it's additive to the conversation as well. That is literally part of my mandate within my day-to-day job here in the Hub. So if anyone wants to have a conversation afterwards about association networks, Jorge, I might follow up with you, to be honest. That would be fantastic. But in terms of practical tips, research these associations to know what depth they have, what reach they have, what is the frequency of convenings that they pull off in order to bring market actors together? And what are their priority topics that align with development, whether it's green energy, technology, innovation, food security, and et cetera? I'll hand it back to you, Lane.
Thank you so much, Mandeep. I think, yes, exactly. I'm on that wavelength too. So let's turn to a couple of questions. Mache, thank you so much for your question. I'm going to put this to the panel, including Ben. So Mache says, I really appreciate the emphasis on trust and how it fosters positive change between the implementer, donor, and beneficiary. One area I've been investigating in my line of work is the pros and cons of donor implementation durations, right? So our project cycles. The difference between the USAID's 5-year cycle and SDC's 10 to 15-year cycles. And he's asking Ben and Lane, but I'm going to put it out to the group as well. Has anyone looked into some of these differences in donor funding and commitment cycles as an indicator of change in the system? I know there are some cases, Jorge, I think you're one, where we extend even longer, but this question of the lag time for systemic change and transformation within a market systems development approach has been a question mark for a while. So I would just invite any of you to comment. I don't know, Ben or Jorge in particular, if you guys have something to say.
I think it's a fascinating question, if I may jump in. I wouldn't say that I'm aware of anything that specifically looked and compared across funders for how those differences have had an impact, but something I could point to, which is also coming out under the MSP activity shortly, and I think is very complementary to the enduring results work that Mandeep referenced, is that MSP is funding a series of ex post studies on USAID funded programs that have used principles of a market systems development approach. And initially 3 have been funded. And the first one recently occurred in Senegal. And just to note that actually that is one of the key findings that actually came out of that. In that particular case, we looked at a set of 2 nearly back-to-back programs funded by USAID. And it was really clear as one of the findings from that study, which will be shortly published, that really a lot of the major traction that the second program managed to achieve was very much built on the work created by the first. And so in total, the 2 programs together were roughly, I'd say, about a 10-year or so programming duration. And really, it was very clear if things had stopped after the 5, it would have been a lot of the changes that the second phase ended up achieving would not have happened. So,
Thanks, Ben.
If I may, Lane, really quickly, just adding to what Ben shared, I would encourage folks that work with AID to look at award mechanisms such as the single award IDIQ that allows for a slightly longer than normal window of implementation. TMS was awarded through that type of award mechanism, and it in practice meant that from the start we knew that there was a very strong possibility that it was going to be at least a 7-year activity, and having those extra 2 years really played a key role in terms of being able to like try to bring to reality these theoretical concepts about really going in without an agenda of these are going to be the economic sectors and these are going to be like our main things that are going to be delivering results from the start, because we knew that we had a little bit of a longer window of time. I think I would be naive and probably not honest if I didn't say that we would probably have been more conservative than we ended up being in terms of looking at some really innovative ideas if we didn't know that we had those 2 extra years to play with to try to achieve the activity goals. Back to you, Lane.
Thank you so much, Jorge. And I was thinking about the examples you shared. For example, you mentioned today the inception phase as a space to kind of kick things off and really lay that groundwork. Let's go to a next question. This one from David Biriangiro. I apologize if I'm not getting your name pronounced very well. Who's on the USAID FGF Aurora with Hazy project. And David says there are a lot of great examples in the paper of how learning has worked well. Working within a project, however, demonstrated ROI, return on investment, and business case for learning will always be a primary barrier, among others. What are your thoughts on how to prove the business case for learning, that it is an investment worthy of pursuing as a business or organization more broadly? And I don't know, Mandeep or Jorge, if you guys have something to offer. My own 2 cents, I'm going to weigh in just for a moment as a learning advisor, is that I think within USAID, we've really gotten some significant traction around this concept that learning is part of program design and management. We are getting budget allocation and making that business case, but I'd be really interested to hear from others about how you're seeing this play out within the market systems development field in particular, and where we're still struggling to get some more buy-in, particularly from the enterprises, right? The system we're trying to shift. So I don't know, I invite my panelists to chime in.
Happy to start off with a few remarks here. I really love
Thanks.
that question. And if the audience has thoughts, please add them to the chat as well. I'd actually go back to one of Ben's earlier slides that actually, instead of using the word learning, I think the question was, do we have to call it learning? And instead actually private sector language into play here. Because my immediate reaction, David, and to anyone with that same curiosity, is perhaps it's a reframing of not the business case for learning, but the business case for market research, the business case for business intelligence, for customer centricity. The way I look at it, this can play out in so many different levels for both the firm and the market actors, but the business needs to have a very close understanding and that feedback loop between their end customer and themselves in order to thrive and remain a going concern. And so that to me is learning. And I think that is part of what this report, this brief is really getting at. In just classical marketing, when we're talking about the market systems in general, in some parts of the world, in certain industries, even here in the United States, players within the same industry might need to collaborate with each other, not just to compete for their market share of a pie, but you got to expand the pie sometimes and introduce more folks who could be interested in your product. And that to me is the ROI, right? It's increasing the number of customers, increasing the number of individuals in your target market that you can address. So again, my suggestion is reframe away from learning and connect to the business language and the business speak that might resonate more towards the dollars and cents of the bottom line.
Thank you so much, Mandeep. It actually really reminds me of my previous work as a practitioner, artisan groups to product design capacity, and making sure that we never called it learning, actually, which is ironic now being a learning advisor. We want to go to a next question from Betsy, who says, I'm curious about the political economy aspect of all of this. Did the work you did surface any takeaways about the role of power relationships and incentives of individuals and institutions in the system, and how that interacts with learning behavior? Fantastic question. I know, Ben, maybe start with you, and then we can, if others have comments. Ben, you're on mute. I'm sure you're being brilliant.
Thank you. It had to happen at least once. I mean, I think what this really speaks back to was some of the impediments to learning that we surfaced. And one of them that really came out, and it's been touched on a few times already today, was just the role of trust and cooperation and market relationships in enhancing and shaping the extent to which learning actually happens. And so that happens in terms of, there's a lot of implications for that in terms of, for example, the structure of different sectors, where you have a few small number of very large firms, for example, who may have a very powerful role in the system. those can be extremely helpful and enhance learning because they can have more confidence that they're actually going to reap the benefits of investments in education for their suppliers and customers. Alternatively, it can lead to a very closed system in which if you're outside of that mini ecosystem, you actually are cut off from all of the learning that's occurring. So I think there's a lot of market dynamics, or I'm kind of interested in the market dynamics that your question raises in terms of how industry structures really work and how, I think a lot of some of the examples we didn't get a chance to get into really though seek to enhance and build those relationships between market actors better and use mechanisms like the chambers of commerce or other type industry associations, which in some cases, if structured correctly, can create some of that, not always immediately, but over time, create some of that trust that enables learning and sharing to happen. Because ultimately, you have to believe that by sharing what you're learning, you're going to also get returns. You're going to get to learn what others are learning, and so that kind of that back and forth, mechanism really is at the heart of a lot of great learning processes when they can exist.
Does anyone else want to comment on this topic? This question? Pause. I went to a training about virtual facilitation that said you should pause long enough to take a sip of tea. Because it takes people that moment to get off mute. Okay. I know we're running short on time. Maybe one more question that's a little bit related to what you were just speaking to, Ben, but I think is more broadly applicable as well. As we do that, I want to call people's attention to the screen in terms of the key takeaways. Thank you for these. I think that they really wonderfully sum up the key findings in the paper. But maybe one response around how does the entry of the donor sector distort business learning? Right? That's a little bit of an inverse in terms of the conversation we've been having. But as donors, and I'm assuming this means, in terms of our resources, in terms of the influence, in terms of the engagement, how might we actually be kind of working against business-centric or enterprise-centric, market system-centric learning? Does anyone have a quick response?
My immediate reflection, and Ben, not to put words in your mouth, but I know from the paper there was a focus on making sure there are no dependencies placed on the market actors within the areas that we're working in. So to me, that instinctively takes my mind into how do we design our programs and activities in a way that we're literally building resilience and the capabilities of the others that we're touching, as opposed to using our donor funding as a one-time type of injection that will not lead to sustainable outcomes. There's nothing tangible I can offer that, but I would open it to those in the field who probably have a bit more experience than I on that piece.
So we will have to pause the conversation there. I'm going to call out the back and forth that's happening in the chat around that question that you just responded to, Mandeep. Distort or disrupt? Maybe we want to disrupt and not distort, but interesting. We are going to pause the conversation here and look ahead to June when we will have part 2 of this mini series, so to speak. We will be featuring practitioner voices in that conversation. We invite you all back for the second part. I want to thank our panelists, including especially Ben and the MSP team, for the work that they've done on this paper. As you can tell, there's lots of folks that are really excited about it and see opportunities to apply it across the board. So thank you for the quality of work that you've done. We will be in touch with a date for the June webinar, and we do hope you all return. We will also be sending out that paper one more time, maybe a couple more times, just to make sure, share it with a friend, invite a friend to the next webinar. Thank you again to MSP for organizing the webinar and to our colleagues in RFS, Kristen and company, for co-hosting with those of us in PPL. So we will see you again in June. Thank you so much.